I think I'm kicking it off, because Doug's going to say some stuff I disagree with. So better for me to start. But that's whoops. Let me get my technology right. I know you all had some reading material. I don't care if you read it or not. I just want to highlight, you know, when we talk about Texas, we focus in on ERCOT. ERCOT is very different than other market regions of the country, and very different than the non-ERCOT areas of Texas. And my 40 years of electricity career has been spent primarily in ERCOT through our various incarnations. And I'm happy to go into those details, but they come up periodically, and I just caution as you read about national concerns and national issues that there needs to be a little bit of translation that goes on as we talk about ERCOT. I also wanted to highlight there was a podcast video that was part of those materials with an interview with Zach Dell of Base Power. Base Power puts batteries in residences and then monetizes the value of that storage, basically getting free real estate for the technology that they then get to aggregate. There is a program, an existing program within the ERCOT rules that enable that, and that's this ADER, which we're going to talk about, this aggregated distributed energy resources. We're going to talk about that. So just to highlight, if anybody did their reading, at least you get a little credit because I actually talked about it. I also want to show this simple diagram. Everybody should know this by now. And credit to Google's Gemini for providing me this nice picture. I want to, and part of the difference in emphasis, I think, between Doug and I as we talk today, my focus is, sorry, I'm going to screw up the camera, but my focus is in the yellow and blue. It's what I would call the bulk system, the generation and transmission aspects of our grid. And there's really a fine line, or a discrete line here at what's labeled here is the step-down transformer, that load-serving transformer. And what we're here to talk about today is how can this stuff down here at the customer level, my focus is going to be how can it contribute up at the bulk system, okay? Doug has a little bit different perspective in kind of how can we make this aspect of our system more efficient. So hopefully that picture makes that sense. I will use the term, and you'll see it later, I use the term big wires, big poles, that's the blue, small wires, small poles, that's the green, okay? Is that where I wanted to be? It's a little help for, I'm going to skip over some of those definitions because I think everybody has their own definitions. I also have a little bit of difference of opinion in terms. We talked about passive DER. I consider passive DER just demand management. I consider all of this just when I consume electricity, just like I consume any other thing I buy, whether that's a plane ticket or an apple or a gallon of gas, I make a choice about when I buy and how much I pay for that as prices change. Affecting my demand certainly has an impact on what needs to be supplied. That's different than, if I can get to the picture, this next picture, different from when I'm at my house, in my household, if I have a bunch of things that can have the potential to inject back into the grid, that really is the opportunity to supply. Not only am I affecting what looks like my demand, but I'm actually supplying. Subtle but nuanced difference. And where some of my personal proclivities rest is I get frustrated when we want to pay sort of demand management as if it were a supply resource. And that's not exactly a one-for-one trade-off, and we can get into some of those details if need be. I will probably come back to this picture as we go through it, but this is, it's the same green, yellow, blue boxes that we had, but here's our house where we've got all this new technology. We have EVs that can charge and potentially discharge that stored energy, right? They're just a big battery on wheels. We have discrete battery storage, a box in your garage that maybe Base Power has provided you along with your retail contract. You have solar PVs on the roof that can stay within your confines, right, and charge up your battery, charge up your EV, or potentially discharge out to the grid, okay? As I think about it, I try to draw lines around back to the boxes. Where's the finite line that is my premise, my demand? How is that crossing back into supply on the other side? So getting into a couple of, I don't know if they're misconceptions, maybe preconceptions, particularly as we talk about wires, the use of the wires in the air, the transmission system. There can be a misconception that low utilization of those wires is inefficient. And I would like to correct some of that misconception by saying, because of how we plan that bulk system, that bulk transmission system, we plan it so that any one of those lines can disappear and nobody knows the difference. So to accomplish that, under circumstances when all the lines are in service, some of them will not be carrying much electricity. They're basically the backup or the reserve that allows that flexibility to exist, okay? There's a couple of simple examples I can draw through if that's of interest, but that kind of situation also exists in the small poles and wires, but that system can be a little bit more balkanized, a little bit more discrete. The bulk electric system, transmission, generators, big poles, big wires, is all connected. And anything, it can be very small, or maybe not a measurable impact, but anything that wiggles on one end of the system will be felt across the system. I had the opportunity, the first job in this industry was for a very large utility in Florida. And as I was learning about the electric system and then trying to show off to my parents how much I had learned and what I knew, I said, yeah, can you believe it? It's all interconnected. If somebody turns their light switch on in Florida, they can feel it all the way in Maine. That's what we call those interconnected systems across the country. They are synchronously interconnected. The magic and phenomenon that is AC, alternating current electricity. ERCOT is the same thing, frankly, on a smaller scale, and because we're smaller, we can suffer bigger impacts. The similarly sized disruption in ERCOT will be felt more broadly or bigger than it would be on the east or west side of America. It's the nature of the physics of the systems that we're dealing with. The other misconception is that small customers are just, go back to my boxes, the yellow, blue, green boxes, red boxes, it all sort of flowed one way. And that is historically how we've thought about the electric system, where power just, it's generated at the generator and it just flows downhill to customers. And that is changing and that is evolving as we have more and different end use systems and opportunities at the residential level that can inject back. And so focusing on how those consumers can contribute. Now, there's a difference. There's a scale problem here. The scale problem of, residential consumers use electricity in kilowatts, which is 0.001 megawatts. It's a very small piece when we consider how we talk about the bulk grid in terms of megawatts. So at a bulk grid level, can I detect an individual consumer making a choice or making a difference in how they're discharging their battery or charging their electric vehicle? Probably not. I need to aggregate them, and ERCOT already has a pilot program that allows that aggregation such that hundreds or thousands of those customers' impacts can be seen at the wholesale level. Okay. The other aspects that I'm going to hit on a couple of times, there was, in the aftermath of Winter Storm Uri in the 21 session, there was a prohibition enacted against retail customers being exposed to wholesale pricing. It was I would describe an appropriate but knee-jerk reaction to the failure of Griddy Electricity, if anybody was around then, who offered those kind of plans to residential consumers. As we move in to try to think about how can residential consumer actions be aggregated in a way that's felt at the wholesale level, that prohibition, I believe, will become stifling to that capability. And we may need to rethink whether that prohibition needs to continue to exist or should be lifted along with maybe some customer protections. That'll come up. I'm sure will come up as we go through some of this discussion. So ADER, aggregated distributed energy resources, what is it? It's just as I described, it's an opportunity for a competitive retailer to aggregate impacts across many customers, hundreds if not thousands, and have those impacts actually provide services at the wholesale level. Some of those services could be things like ancillary services, reserve capacity that's held, or capacity that's held in reserve and turned into energy at some point. What would that look like? Well, if I'm base power and I've got batteries strung out throughout the system and I'm providing that reserve capacity to ERCOT and being paid to provide that every hour, when that gets called on to be turned into energy, I discharge some or all of those batteries in the various households that I've placed them. That's an example of how that would work. And there was a question.
So am I understanding this correctly that, because I remember pre-2021, you'd go to HEB, you'd go to Kroger's, and there'd be Green Mountain Energy, there'd be whomever selling you a plant. Mm-hmm. And those were retailers who really were, had like bought some type of prepaid, they're making a play, and they're passing that on to customers, essentially. And what base power, I guess, is doing, or what ADERs, but they had no infrastructure, right? Of like Green Mountain Energy, they didn't have their own power plant. Like I'm using
yes.
They don't have their own deal. But what base power is essentially doing,
they didn't at that time.
They did at that time.
Yeah.
What, just so I know, okay, because making sure sanity checker right there. Because we're saying, what if we gave them some infrastructure? Or what if they were able to build that and then create a real savings for customers and resiliency to the grid? Am I understanding that correctly?
Not exactly, but let me back up a couple of steps. I was going to skip over my very basic intro question, but let me do it now to bring you all in. Raise your hand if you pay your own electricity bill. I have the opportunity to speak to college students a lot, and I love asking that question because they just look around and nobody pays their bill. So sorry for availing you of that. You pay your own bill. How many of you actually have the opportunity to choose your provider? And that's going to be a very small piece here because of where we are in Austin, between the City of Austin, Pedernales Electric, Bluebonnet Electric, all of which are public power and don't have aren't required to offer that. So back to your question, as you were talking, the irony, Green Mountain was bought by NRG and is part of the Reliant companies now. So, and Reliant is a kind of a bundled provider. They have retail and generation. And as you described it, yeah, early retailers were just buying electricity from somebody to be able to sell to customers. Green Mountain's play was they were buying green power. They were buying output from wind generators and selling it to consumers because they had a choice. I want my electricity to be produced by green power, hence their name. Another way to hedge that was availing themselves or trying to match a customer demand or customer interest. But another way to just kind of hedge that supply is you have power plants on the other side, and that's the aggregated NRG portfolio, power plants and load balanced. Same thing at Vistra or with Luminant and their generation as well, Luminant and TXU. In terms of base power, I don't know, and they are a retailer, they are a rep, they have to have some electricity supply from somewhere, right? Their batteries batteries are not really supply. Batteries move electricity from one time to another. Everybody with me on that? They take electricity generated at one point in time, store it, and use it at a different point in time. And in fact, there's some amount of loss there. You don't get everything out that you put in. So they're not creating supply. So base power is, back to your example, they've got to be buying electricity from somebody and then using these boxes, if you will, using their storage in people's garages as a way to control the demand or potentially control the demand or usage of a particular consumer to keep within the portfolio of the energy that they've procured. They also may be using it to then provide services back to the grid, which is just another revenue source that company can avail themselves because of this aggregation. You still look confused. What more?
No, I can see kind of what they're doing. So they're getting paid multiple times.
In multiple ways. They're providing different products and services and getting paid for different products and services.
And this didn't exist pre-2021?
The ADER pilot program did not exist in 2021. This is, where are we, 2026? It's it was a Will McAdams, Jimmy Clodfelty, brainchild at the commission. So we're probably, so we're probably, 3 or 4 years into it as a pilot. 20, okay, so 3 years where, the pilot was hoping to be like 10 megawatts in aggregate, and we're up over 100 megawatts in a variety of services on our way to probably 500 megawatts is the next stage. And I would expect, and it's still a pilot. And what does a pilot mean? A pilot means people just kind of do stuff, and we don't hold, we say, well, let's start small. We're not going to worry about compliance or, the firmness of metering, and we're just going to, try to see how this works. I like that approach, but we're now reaching a size where there has to start being some requirements and compliance around it. So I expect to happen over the next year or so. Yeah.
But part of that, the whole state of charge conversation, because where did that, I kind of fell off of that. Where did that get left?
So the state of charge conversation is less, it applies at this level, right? Because if I'll pick on base power just because they're doing it. If I'm base power and I've got thousands of these residential scale batteries out there, and I've committed to provide some X megawatts of responsive reserve, and then, oh my gosh, now I have to provide the energy associated. I have to provide I've sold megawatts, and now I have to sell provide the megawatt hours when I'm deployed. If I don't have enough state of charge, then I will be in. Today there will be small ramifications. In the future, there would be larger ramifications of not having sufficient state of charge. The larger issue of state of charge is at the bulk system with what I'd call utility scale batteries that look like generators, if you will, on the one hand. There's a tension between who's managing the state of charge on those utility scale batteries. Is it ERCOT or is it the owner of the battery? And why is that important? It's because I see my battery discharging, but I see my load going up. Where's your state of charge? Are you going to be able to continue this for, what should I expect from that? What should ERCOT expect from that facility for the next few hours? So that's a little bit of tension around the state of charge at the bulk system level. Where it's at now is it's primarily, owners get to manage their equipment, but there's an increased communication requirement. And ERCOT has already said, as we're taking taking in the information about what the state of charge of batteries is and looking forward, if we see there's going to be a drop-off and we're not going to have that input from batteries, we may order another power plant to come online to ensure that we have reliability into the future. In the parlance, we're going to ruck for a deficient state of charge. ERCOT's going to ruck for a deficient state of charge. A little bit of tangent, but I love tangents. Don't worry about it. I use some lingo that RUC stands for Reliability Unit Commitment, but it's basically it's ordering a power plant to come online. As this program moves into operational, full-fledged in the protocols, I mentioned there's this tension between the there's this tension between the kind of measurement accuracy versus the program costs or the overhead costs. If you're a 1,000 megawatt combined cycle unit, you have expensive metering associated with your unit that provides very precise and highly validated data about what your output and what your usage is, okay? That doesn't exist at a residential scale. And the cost of trying to do that at a residential scale would be prohibited. So there's a little bit of tension or trade-off between that metering accuracy versus the precision of data that's coming out of that. We'll be dealing with that in the ERCOT sphere over the next year or so, just to ensure ourselves that we get it the right way. Just a summary of the sort of the big poles and wires versus the small poles and wires, trying to transition into kind of what Doug's going to focus on. There's a bright line, there's a bright dividing line between the two systems currently. There are, although in aggregate numbers, it seems like there's hundreds of entities everywhere, but the distribution utilities now encompass all of the small municipal utilities, all of those small electric co-ops, and if memory serves, I'm not sure if it's still accurate or not, every single legislative representative has a co-op in their district, if that's still accurate. I know it was accurate. That was a selling point at one point in time. They're everywhere, and they're not very large. And they have at the distribution level have some level of autonomy. They're member-owned. They get to kind of do their own thing in a variety of ways. That can make it hard to impose requirements or to, just because of the nature of the industry and that different level of regulatory oversight. Similarly with municipal-owned utilities and their level of control. The distribution utilities themselves are, as I showed in the boxes earlier, they are not part of ERCOT's purview. ERCOT doesn't have anything to do with distribution utilities. Now, there are many companies, Encore, CenterPoint, that own both big poles and small poles. They are both a transmission provider and a distribution provider. And that can, they will have mechanisms for, or different ways of dealing with it both ways.
Question for you on that
Yep.
one. On the transmission side, 15 entities representing 90% of load. Is that other 10% outside the ERCOT market?
No, this is within ERCOT. That other 10% is the hundreds of little bitty potential, it's the, it's a small amount of transmission facilities that are owned elsewhere, and generally reflected in kind of aggregated up into G&T, generation transmission co-ops. So Brazos Electric is one that comes to mind. South Texas Electric Cooperative is another that comes to mind. It'll be some transmission facilities owned by some of their members, yeah, primarily. Just to bring us up, it would have been helpful to have this at the beginning, but ERCOT is we use that term ERCOT or I use it to describe a variety of things. We use it to talk about a geographic location. I use it to talk about a building with 1,000 employees that do things. I use it to talk about the member stakeholder process that decides things. All of those are very different, and we use the same word. I apologize for that. But if we go back to 1999 and the establishment of retail competition, that forced fundamental changes to how work happens and created the ERCOT organization's role, a variety of roles for them. None of those roles touch on the distribution system. Okay, although they are this clearing point for retail switching. That's as close to dealing with a distribution provider as they get. But all they're really focused on is that unique identifier for a customer, and saying this customer belongs to this retailer provider. When a switch comes in, it says I'm moving it from this provider to this provider, and there's very little interaction with the distribution utility themselves. Talked about the different types of distribution companies. Recommendations is this prohibition on retail customers being exposed to wholesale prices. If I make the choice on my own to buy a battery and stick it in my garage, and there's a program that would allow me to, sell that at the wholesale level when prices are high, well, I need to be exposed to those high wholesale prices. I have to be able to see them. I have to be able to know when to react to those. And the most effective way is to actually be exposed to those prices, because then I'm really motivated to make sure my power gets generated or produced at that time. The other aspect that might come into play, depending on how we talk about kind of virtual power plants and how they evolve, is the criteria for being a utility embedded in Pura, and I can't quote you where it is or how, it's spread throughout there, but the criteria for being a utility may need to be refined. For example, this idea of, if subdivision wants to invest some money and put a power plant in their, instead of having a pool in their in their mud park, they're going to put a power plant there, so that if Uri happens again, they'll have their own power plant to fund the neighborhood, or to power the neighborhood. That is an entity serving multiple customers that would seem to butt up, and it would seem to make that entity a utility. And distribution utilities have other kinds of obligations and they have an obligation to serve, for one thing, in Pura. And so if we want to think about the opportunities to have more and different kinds of structures, the fundamental definition of what is a utility will need to be reevaluated. And my parting thought is, in a room full of politicos, electricity flows follow the laws of physics. There are many parts of the country where they try to define, zones as states or rule, and electricity knows no state boundaries. If the wires are connected, electricity will flow. Electricity follows physics, not politics. And that has implications for various policy choices. Okay.
Wait, you mean we're not all powerful?
It just has implications. I'm
You
not
can pass laws that'll change the laws of physics. They would probably have limited effect.
limited effect.
But
That's a great. So I think with that, I'm going to hand it over to Doug and let him do his piece of it.
All right. So time check. How much time?
We have about 15 minutes.
Okay, cool. Let me actually start with this slide. So first of all, thanks so much to Powerhouse for organizing it. Thanks to each and every one of you for being here. This is so important to have these kind of spaces where you can ask questions and hear from different people. I've seen the roster of all the classes. It's really incredible. So I really appreciate what Powerhouse is doing here and each and every one of you for taking the time. My name is Doug Lewin. I work on the Google Energy team. And I want to just pick up on some of these themes Beth was talking about. And the main theme I actually really want to focus on is system utilization as a means to potentially increase grid reliability, resilience, and affordability, right? To actually drive prices lower. So when Beth said storage actually isn't generation, right? This is one of these questions that happens, kind of a philosophical question that energy nerds get into a lot. What exactly is storage? But whatever it is, what we know that it does is it does, as Beth accurately said, move the time that the energy is. So you're actually like filling the battery right and then deploying it at different times. And this matters tremendously for the grid because what we have, and we see this acutely in Texas, right? Where we have a system where we have to build out T&D, right? If you think of transmission distribution, if you think of your like highway systems, right? You're trying to build your highways to deal with the peak flow of traffic, right? 5 p.m. on a middle of the week kind of a day. Well, so when is the peak traffic on the electric grid? Anybody want to take a guess? July, about what time of day?
Noon.
Yes, noon, and even later, like 3, 4, 5 o'clock. But yes, right, when it's super hot out in the summertime, yes. We also have, interestingly, some winter events where the load actually rivals summer, right? We don't actually know in Winter Storm Uri what the load was because it couldn't be served and thus it couldn't be measured. But there are several different academics that have posited it somewhere, done studies on this, more than posited, actually studied it and looked at somewhere in the ballpark of 85 to 95 gigawatts, which would be more than our summer peak, right? So you also have to build a T&D system, transmission distribution system, to deal with that huge peak. So a key goal here, right? At the highest level, right, the goal is higher reliability, lower costs, right? That's the big goal. How do you achieve that? You need to reduce peaks and fill valleys. And the filling valleys is an important part too, because that then spreads the unit cost. The way the grid works for the parts that are not competitive, the transmission and distribution, which the costs are spread across all consumers, it's a simple division problem, right? Numerator, denominator. The more people you have buying those units, the more you can carve those costs up and actually lower costs. So the filling values is important too, which is one reason why storage is such a great resource, because you're actually doing both things. You're actually reducing peaks and increasing the valleys. But if you think about what I think is another absolutely critical technology for our grid, heat pumps. So where you have one of our biggest problems with Winter Storm Uri was resistance heat. I think you guys have talked about this in some of the previous classes. Do you guys know that term, resistance heat? Tell me if you don't. Okay, so it's a really, okay, so everybody knows? All right, so having heat pumps in there is gonna reduce those peaks both in the winter time and in the summertime, okay? So that is really a really key point is our system utilization. Now, there's a lot of terms, a lot of nomenclature among energy nerds, and you guys, just by virtue of being here, congratulations, you're energy nerds. So we can say things like virtual power plants here, and it's said a lot in conferences. It's talked about a lot at the PUC and at ERCOT. That's fine. I like to refer to these as neighborhood energy systems, because if you ask a person who does not think about energy as much as y'all do, what do you think of a virtual power plant? What do you think? I've had the privilege of seeing polling and even focus groups on this. What do you think most people say when you say, what do you think of a virtual power plant? How did you react to it before you were like, initiated into the energy nerd group?
Power plant's either real or it's not.
Bingo. Bingo. And this is exactly what we see in the polling and the focus groups. Anytime you ask somebody, do you want a virtual power plant? They're like, a power plant that's not real? I'm not interested in that. Thank you very much. These are quite real resources. When we're talking about residential batteries and heat pumps, to the point of the laws of physics, these have a huge impact on the grid in a positive way when they're integrated right, which is a lot of what the challenge is, okay? So just to illustrate the point one more time, and we'll hopefully be able to distribute this afterwards. I have to use the clicker for it. Thank you. Okay. All right. But I actually want to go backwards, so I'm going to go up. Okay. So this is from a report called Bridging the Load Gap. Alliance to Save Energy did this study with ad hoc group. Google commissioned it. And this is just an illustrative view. We might actually see in Texas, this might actually look a little bit different, but you get the idea. By doing a range of different batteries, heat pumps, different kinds of energy efficiency like insulation, you can actually, and we haven't done an achievable energy efficiency study like this in Texas, I don't think in a couple of decades. I used to work here as a staffer, and there was a bill in 2007 that required the PUC to do an achievable energy efficiency study. We did one back then. I don't think there's been one done since, but the definition of achievable, which is covered at the top, is basically it's not what's technically possible, it's what's economically rational. In other words, if we don't do these various things, we're actually just leaving money on the table. We're actually wasting not only energy, but wasting money. And this is a very typical illustrative kind of thing. You usually see there's something like 15 to 20%. In Texas, where we've done less energy efficiency than many other states, this is actually probably a much bigger number. But hopefully it just makes the point. So the key here again is utilization. We really want to try to utilize the system more. And when you do that, you have a couple of different things that can happen. And this one actually comes from a study called the Untapped Grid. There is a coalition which Google is a part of called the Utilize Coalition. And they put out this study. Highly recommend you spend some time with this study. But I think this is kind of like the main point of the study is that you can find places on the grid where there is a lot of headroom, and there is a lot of headroom on our grid. We do have a lot of space right now, not in every place, not at every time. Do we have a ton of headroom on a 0-degree morning in January at 6 a.m.? No. Do we have a ton of headroom on a 110-degree day in Houston and Dallas on a July afternoon? No, we don't. But there's 8,760 hours in the year, and on 8,500, 8,600, even 8,700 of those hours, there is a lot of spare capacity. So it's identifying that headroom to actually increase system utilization, working on, and this is where things can get really interesting, is as you're bringing new loads into the system, you are spreading those fixed costs out. So that is data centers. It's not just data centers, right? It can be steel mills. It can be electrified oil and gas operations. It could be semiconductor fabs, right? These big users can, if integrated in the right way, and that is a huge if, and I'm happy to talk about it, right? It gets into transmission cost allocation, a lot of these issues, but if done right, these increased loads and increased sales can lead to lower rates. And I'll talk more about that before I finish. But there's a couple, so this is one more slide from that Untapped Grid, and it shows different ways you can kind of go about increasing system utilization. So there's, loads that are flexible and are going to use the power that's available on the grid in the times where there is an abundance of that power. And then you're also looking at reductions in the peak, right? So you're changing these load shapes. This is why batteries are such a great application for this, right? Whether they're put at the location of the large load, whether they're put distributed. So sometimes this is referred to as, so at Google, we have taken the ratepayer protection pledge. We've done all, we're going to pay for our transmission. We're going to pay for, upgrades to the system. We're going to bring our own generation. This is, and I want to be real clear about this. I probably should have said this up front. I want to be real clear. I have been working on this stuff for decades. I love it. It is not a panacea. This is not like doing, whether you want to call them neighborhood energy systems or virtual power plants or bring your own distributed capacity. This is not going to solve all our problems. But if you think there is something else that will solve all our problems, I have bad news for you. There is no one thing, right? One of my favorite phrases I think I first learned in this building is there is no silver bullet, only silver buckshot, right? We're going to have to do dozens of things right. So Google's investing in geothermal, we're investing in nuclear, we're investing in long duration energy storage. Like all of these things are going to be necessary. And this is one piece of the puzzle. I would argue it is a very, very important piece of the puzzle. But it really comes down to changing these load shapes, filling valleys, reducing peaks, and increasing the system utilization. And I want to leave you with one more here. This comes from so this is actually in the untapped grid, but the original slide comes from the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab and Brattle Group did a study on residential electricity price trends. It originally came out in October 2025. They published an update in April. Again, highly recommend you spend time with that. There is nuance to this. It is a very nuanced kind of a thing. But the sort of headline here is that load growth can enable downward pressure on rates. You can see the TX right here. We have had significant load growth in Texas before the data center build out started. So I want to be real clear about that. Over the last 5 years, we've seen an average of 5.5% increase compared to like 1 to 2% for the 20 years before. So we went from, it took us about 20 years to get from 300 terawatt hours to 400 terawatt hours, 20 years to increase that 100. The next 100 increase happened in the last 4 years. We didn't quite cross 500, but we're like 490 terawatt hours. So 4 years to get that next 100. So we are already seeing massive load growth in Texas. Where is that coming from? Is it coming from residential? Is it coming from large commercial? Even though so many people are moving here and we're building new homes, we are seeing basically flat residential load in Texas. It is commercial and industrial, so a lot of that is electrified oil and gas, a lot is the semiconductors, the beginnings of data center build out. And when you have that, again, if you do a lot of different things right, including the transmission cost allocation, you can actually put downward pressure on rates. So highly recommend you spend time with any of those different reports. We can send them out, I think, afterwards. And I'm happy to answer any questions or to follow up and send additional resources if you're interested.
I'm definitely interested because I don't see my electricity bill going down.
Yeah. And as a matter of fact, there's another slide on here in this presentation that shows, so this is averaged across all load classes. When you put in residential, it's actually slightly above the line in Texas, but that's also inflation adjusted, right? So like the cost of eggs and milk, famously, gas, like everything's going up. And so basically electricity prices are rising roughly along that same trajectory. Yes?
Well, okay, so you mentioned that the denominator, I've heard the larger denominator kind of solves all ails argument.
It doesn't solve, nothing solves all.
Right.
Yes,
So,
yes.
Okay, well, I guess the silver buckshot approach.
Yes,
Could you
yes.
speak to the details of how that chart actually works out? Like saying that, again, you mentioned transmission cost allocation, which is near and dear to my heart. Could you just like pontificate
Yeah.
a bit about?
So I've been at two different forums lately where a representative for Texas Utility was talking and saying we have had long needed grid upgrades that have been needed. They're like $1.2 billion. It's in an area where there's a lot of data centers. The grid is 30 to 40 years old. They need to update stuff. They're going to need to spend this money anyway. And with the large loads in the area, they calculate they're going to be able to collect 1.6 billion based on that 1.2 billion dollar upgrade. Like here's the basic point, Gary, is like we have to do massive investments in our grid anyway. Look at the aftermath of Hurricane Beryl and all that CenterPoint is spending to harden its system. Right? Look at what's going on in any utility area in the country. We've got to make major investments in our grid to increase the resiliency and the reliability of the grid. And then the question becomes what the division question is, how many times are you going to divide that up? Are you going to put all of those upgrades on residential, small commercial, or are you going to be able to spread that out among a much larger number of users? And this is actually like a very fundamental concept in electricity and goes back to the very earliest days of the electricity industry. And show of hands, who's heard the name Sam Insull? All right, if you really want to be an energy nerd, you got to look up Sam Insull. There's a great biography written of him called The Merchant of Power, but he's a fascinating man. He was one of the richest men in America in the 1920s and then died penniless in a Paris subway because he had over leveraged himself and lost all his money. So like fascinating American story from rags to riches and back to rags again. But the point for this is he was Edison's right-hand man. He left Edison to go start a utility in Chicago, Commonwealth Edison, which still exists to this day. And he did that because he wanted to build it out from scratch. And if you think back to those early days, what was the electric grid used for in the earliest days? When if you're looking at a load shape I just screwed up here. Okay, let's see. If you're looking at a load shape in 1915, right? Well, let's go back even further. 1905, 1910. What does that load shape look like? Flat, 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 flat until when? When does it go up? Night. Why?
It's dark. They need light.
They need lights. So literally, you get this peak for like 2 or 3 hours, and then what happens?
Goes off.
Goes down. So he's trying to build out a system for sales that are going to be 2 or 3 hours a day. And so the cost of lighting was fantastically expensive, and only the wealthy could afford it. And when you look at even inflation adjusted, people were paying like 50 cents to $1 a kilowatt hour for their light bulbs, which were terribly inefficient as well, right? So what did he do? He said, we're going to get the manufacturers, the meat packing plants in Chicago. We're going to get them on the grid. They had all these weird mechanical contraptions that were powering their stuff. And he said, hey, we'll sell you really cheap power, because then he could carve up those fixed costs of the grid. He got all the electric trolley cars, right? We still have, if you walk around Austin, you still see downtown the rail lines that used to run the electric. Every city had electric trolleys for decades in the first half of the last century. Got them onto the system. Now you get to a point where that lighting gets down from 50 cents to 25 cents to 20, down to 10 to 5 cents. Now everybody can afford light. And now he can build even more infrastructure, and the wheel keeps turning, right? So this is very fundamental to the very history of electric utilities. The more users you have, the more you can divide up those fixed costs, the more prices can go down.
I would push back respectfully a bit, because if you look at the most recent ERCOT load projection, it's 87% coming from data centers. There's on their most recent reports. So I think that's a rather concentrated source of demand.
Concentrated in one industry, but not necessarily geographically, right? It's spread out all over. There is in ERCOT, and I'd be happy to send this so you guys can send it around. The ERCOT CEO, Pablo Vegas, made a presentation to the board. I don't think it was the last meeting, it might have been 2 meetings ago, where he showed the overall costs of transmission are going up in Texas quite a bit. The unit cost has been flat.
Yeah, don't show that. Don't share that. That was a bad analysis.
Okay. Well, we should share why it's a bad analysis too. But I mean,
here's our 90. Here's that 10%. Yeah.
Okay.
No, it was. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
May I just, because I think there's just an important distinction, right? So if, let's just say data centers are 85% of new demand, which is probably accurate, right? So the math is, I use this much energy, right? Out of so much energy that's being delivered. So I, whatever number of megawatt hours. And then that's the sort of the overall cost of the transmission and infrastructure then being allocated on a proportional basis. So the portion of demand that's coming from data centers like doesn't necessarily mean that like there's a misallocation there, because the more energy they use, the more of the infrastructure that's being ascribed to them goes into that rate base. It really comes down to what's the cost recovery mechanism on that, and I think that's where maybe just making that distinction between how much energy am I using, which in and of itself can make for better utilization of the grid, versus how am I recovering the cost in particular on the infrastructure to serve that, which is, I think, more of the focus.
You made a good point in terms of the cost allocation and we're mixing up kilowatts and kilowatt hours here, and so it's easy to get mushed up and think about it in different terms. Gary, you and I had talked earlier about how from a transmission cost allocation, which is where a lot of these costs are showing up, currently those costs are allocated on a demand basis, on a very narrowly defined demand basis. As you know, as those cost allocation mechanisms are being reviewed right now, and we'll have a report later, that will likely evolve or change going forward. And one adjustment that could help mitigate some of the shifting of costs, if you will, towards smaller consumers is to introduce that energy component to a cost allocation mix.
Beth, that's a really important point, and I want to be real clear. I think I was clear about this, but I'll say it again just in case I wasn't. Like this is not like ipso facto, like more large load equals lower rates. Like there are things that have to happen for that to work, and transmission cost allocation is one of those. Google is on the record for a minimum transmission charge. Like we are in favor of changing the 4CP system. So I just want to be clear about that, and it's similar with DERs. There's no guarantee that DERs would make the system cost less. It could make the system cost more if we integrate them the wrong way.
Right.
So this is one of the reasons why I think it does make sense to have policy attention paid to this, because how we integrate these. But what I'm trying to get across is I think there's a whole lot of discussion and angst and frankly some misinformation out there that necessarily large loads are going to drive up costs. It's a nuanced thing, right? When you have more generation in, presumably the supply stack and the generating, that will cause some upward pressure on price. But if you're spreading the costs out among T&D, like that's going to bring it down. So it's a very nuanced kind of thing. But if we do this the right way, we absolutely have the potential, especially in Texas, where we control our own destiny and have less of the FERC, problems that like PJM and MISO and all of them have. We have the potential to attract new load. And while it may say 87%, like who knows how much that's actually going to get built, we are also a place where semiconductor fabs want to come. We are also a place where oil and gas wants to be electrified. We are also a place where steel mills want to come. Like we can attract all kinds of different large loads and do this DER piece, which by the way, like one of the things we didn't really talk about was just putting that heat pump in. That if you do enough of them, and batteries for that matter, you're not only increasing system utilization and helping rates go down generally for everybody, whether they use it or not, but the person that's getting that heat pump at their house, because in Texas, because of those Julys that are 105, 110 degrees, most of your cost as a consumer is going into the cooling of your home or your apartment. Literally like 50 to 70% of what you're paying is based on so that's another formula. It's not only like data centers potentially bringing their own distributed capacity, it's actually directly having an impact on those customers' bills, lowering them 20 to 30% conservatively if you're replacing a really inefficient HVAC with a high efficient heat pump. Yes.
Last week, Commissioner Will McAdams talked about a standardization process for DERs to interconnect to the grid, and then they also talked about it at the State Affairs hearing a couple weeks ago. Could you elaborate on that a little bit and what would be necessary to have a standardization process?
Yeah, and to be clear, Will McAdams and Matt Bombs, I think, was the co-presenter. Those two guys know more about this than I do, so I would, if they say something different than what I say, listen to them. But yeah, I mean, it basically comes down to, you know, it's very similar to like anything you're doing anywhere. If you're talking about a situation where, you know, in Texas we have what 100 different munis, 75 different co-ops, 8 different investor-owned utilities. If each one has their own rule, you end up in a very balkanized system. If I'm a business, and in one way I have to interconnect. Say I'm a solar installer and I have one set of rules when I'm in Corpus Christi, and one set of rules when I'm in Houston, and one set of rules when I'm in Dallas. That is just a major drag. That just the difference alone, much less that in one of those areas it might take me 6 months, 9 months, 12 months to interconnect, whereas in another one it might only be 1 month. Having some kind of standardization around that is really important. And honestly, just like in the DER space, that's that standardization, that kind of common interconnection, but common like weights and measures. Like, how are we actually like measuring the reductions? You need to have some, if not uniformity, at least consistency across different jurisdictions if these technologies are really to scale.
And the challenge, as I tried to point out, is, as Doug mentioned, it's the variety of entities that have to be dealt with, and the different. You can't just write legislation to say, you know, codify consistent distribution interconnection policies across the state, because the munis will say, you can't tell me what to do. They'd say it nicer than that, but you can't tell me what to do. Co-ops, to a different degree, would say those rules don't apply to me because for these for very good reasons. And so getting to that consistency is a challenge. One way to focus on that might be to just start with the regulated entities so that there isn't a difference between Dallas and Houston and Corpus, because they're all served by investor-owned, fully regulated entities. And you start there to develop a, sort of the regulated, consistent focus, and bring them in line, and the rest will probably follow.
It's such a great point, because the 4 investor-owned utilities within ERCOT are 70 to 75% of the load, give or take.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Depending on the measure.
So
Yeah.
it's the classic like 80-20 problem. Like you
Exactly.
like focus on the 80%. Yeah. Makes sense.
Exactly.
We're gonna have to stop the conversation here. We are at time, but let's give it a hand for our